Kia ora. Welcome to Campfire Stories. I'm Rose from Christchurch City Libraries, and I'm reading Agatha Christie's The Moving Finger. The next week, I think, was one of the queerest times I have ever passed through. It had an odd dream quality. Nothing seemed real. The inquest on Agnes Waddle was held, and the curious of Lymstock attended en masse. No new facts came to light, and the only possible verdict was returned: murder by person or persons unknown. So poor little Agnes Waddle, having had her hour of limelight, was duly buried in the quiet old churchyard, and life in Lymstock went on as before. No, that last statement is untrue. Not as before. There was a half-scared, half-avid gleam in almost everybody's eye. Neighbour looked at neighbour. One thing had been brought out clearly at the inquest. It was most unlikely that any stranger had killed Agnes Waddle. No tramps nor unknown men had been noticed or reported in the district. Somewhere then in Lymstock, walking down the high street, shopping, passing the time of day, was a person who had cracked a defenceless girl's skull and driven a sharp skewer home to her brain. And no one knew who that person was. As I say, the days went by in a kind of dream. I looked at everyone I met in a new light, the light of a possible murderer. It was not an agreeable sensation. And in the evenings, with the curtain drawn, Joanna and I sat talking, arguing, going over in turn all the various possibilities that still seemed so fantastic and incredible. Joanna held firm on her theory of Mr. Pye. I, after wavering a little, had gone back to my original suspect, Miss Ginch. But we went over the possible names again and again. Mr. Pye, Miss Ginch, Mrs. Dane Calthrop, Amy Griffith, Emily Barton, Partridge. And all the time, nervously, apprehensively, we waited for something to happen. But nothing did happen. Nobody, so far as we knew, received any more letters. Nash made periodic appearances in the town, but what he was doing and what traps the police were setting, I had no idea. Graves had gone again. Emily Barton came to tea. Megan came to lunch. Owen Griffith went about his practice. We went and drank sherry with Mr. Pye, and we went to tea at the vicarage. I was glad to find Mrs. Dane Calthrop displayed none of the militant ferocity she had known on the occasion of our last meeting. I think she had forgotten all about it. She seemed now principally concerned with the destruction of white butterflies so as to preserve cauliflower and cabbage plants. Our afternoon at the vicarage was really one of the most peaceful we had spent. It was an attractive old house, and had a big, shabby, comfortable drawing room with faded rose cretonne. The Dane Calthrops had a guest staying with them, an amiable elderly lady who was knitting something with white fleecy wool. Wonder who this might be. We had very good hot scones for tea. The vicar came in and beamed placidly on us whilst he pursued his gentle, erudite conversation. It was very pleasant. I don't mean that we got away from the topic of murder, because we didn't. Miss Marple, the guest, was naturally thrilled by the subject. As she said apologetically, "We have so little to talk about in the country." She had made her mind up that the dead girl must have been just like her Edith. Such a nice little maid, and so willing, but sometimes a little slow to take in things. Miss Marple also had a cousin whose niece's sister-in-law had had a great deal of annoyance and trouble over some anonymous letters, so the letters also were very interesting to the charming old lady. "But tell me, dear," she said to Mrs. Dane Calthrop, "what do the village people, the townspeople say? What do they think?" "Mrs. Cleet still, I suppose," said Joanna. "Oh no," said Mrs. Dane Calthrop, "not now." Miss Marple asked who Mrs. Cleet was. Joanna said she was the village witch. "That's right, isn't it, Mrs. Dane Calthrop?" The vicar murmured a long Latin quotation about, I think, the evil power of witches, to which we all listened in respectful and uncomprehending silence. "She's a very silly woman," said his wife, "likes to show off. Goes out to gather herbs and things at the full of the moon and takes care that everybody in the place knows about it." "And silly girls go and consult her, I suppose?" said Miss Marple. I saw the vicar getting ready to unload more Latin on us, and I asked hastily, "But why shouldn't people suspect her of the murder now? They thought the letters were her doing." Miss Marple said, "Oh, but the girl was killed with a skewer, so I hear. Very unpleasant. Well, naturally, that takes all suspicion away from this Mrs. Cleet, because, you see, she could ill-wish her, so that the girl would waste away and die from natural causes." "Strange how these old beliefs linger," said the vicar. "In early Christian times, local superstitions were wisely incorporated with Christian doctrines, and their more unpleasant attributes gradually eliminated." "It isn't superstition we've got to deal with here," said Mrs. Dane Calthrop, "but facts." "And very unpleasant facts," I said. "As you say, Mr. Burton," said Miss Marple. "Now you, excuse me if I am being too personal, are a stranger here, and have a knowledge of the world and of various aspects of life. It seems to me that you ought to be able to find a solution to this distasteful problem." I smiled. "The best solution I have had was a dream. In my dream it all fitted in and panned out beautifully. Unfortunately, when I woke up, the whole thing was nonsense." "How interesting, though. Do tell me how the nonsense went." "Oh, it all started with a silly phrase, 'no smoke without fire.' People have been saying that ad nauseum. And then I got it mixed up with war terms, smoke screens, scrap of paper, telephone messages. No, that was another dream." "And what was that dream?" "The old lady was so eager about it that I felt sure she was a secret reader of Napoleon's Book of Dreams, which had been the great standby of my old nurse." "Oh, only Elsie Holland, the Symington's nursery governess, you know, was getting married to Dr. Griffith, and the vicar here was reading the service in Latin." "Very appropriate, dear," murmured Mrs. Dane Calthrop to her spouse. And then Mrs. Dane Calthrop got up and forbade the banns and said it had got to be stopped. "But that part," I added with a smile, "was true. I woke up and found you standing over me saying it." "And I was quite right," said Mrs. Dane Calthrop, but quite mildly, I was glad to note. "But where did a telephone message come in?" asked Miss Marple, crinkling her brows. "I'm afraid I'm being rather stupid. That wasn't in the dream, it was just before it. I came through the hall and noticed Joanna had written down a message to be given to someone if they rang up." Miss Marple leaned forward. There was a pink spot on each cheek. "Will you think me very inquisitive and very rude if I just ask what the message was?" She cast a glance at Joanna. "I do apologise, my dear." Joanna, however, was highly entertained. "Oh, I don't mind," she assured the old lady. "I can't remember anything about it myself, but perhaps Jerry can. It must have been something quite trivial." Solemnly, I repeated the message as best I could remember it, enormously tickled at the old lady's rapt attention. I was afraid the actual words were going to disappoint her, but perhaps she had some sentimental idea of a romance, for she nodded her head and smiled and seemed pleased. "I see," she said. "I thought it might be something like that." Mrs. Dane Calthrop said sharply, "Like what, Jane?" "Something quite ordinary," said Miss Marple. She looked at me thoughtfully for a moment or two, then she said unexpectedly, "I can see you are a very clever young man, but not quite enough confidence in yourself. You ought to have." Joanna gave a loud hoot. "For goodness sake, don't encourage him to feel like that. He thinks quite enough of himself as it is." "Be quiet, Joanna," I said. "Miss Marple understands me." Miss Marple had resumed her fleecy knitting. "You know," she observed pensively, "to commit a successful murder must be very much like bringing off a conjuring trick. The quickness of the hand deceives the eye. Not only that, you've got to make people look at the wrong thing and in the wrong place. Misdirection, they call it, I believe." "Well," I remarked, So far everybody seems to have looked in the wrong place for our lunatic at large." "I should be inclined myself," said Miss Marple, "to look for somebody very sane." "Yes," I said thoughtfully, "that's what Nash said. I remember he stressed respectability too." "Yes," agreed Miss Marple, "that's very important." Well, we all seemed agreed. I addressed Mrs. Calthrop. "Nash thinks," I said, "that there will be more anonymous letters. What do you think?" She said slowly, "There may be, I suppose." "If the police think that, there will have to be, no doubt," said Miss Marple. I went on doggedly to Mrs. Dane Calthrop. "Are you still sorry for the writer?" She flushed. "Why not?" "I don't think I agree with you, dear," said Miss Marple. "Not in this case." I said hotly, "They've driven one woman to suicide and caused untold misery and heartburnings." "Have you had one, Miss Burton?" asked Miss Marple of Joanna. Joanna gurgled. "Oh, yes, it said the most frightful things." "I'm afraid," said Miss Marple, "that the people who are young and pretty are apt to be singled out by the writer." "That's why I certainly think it's odd that Elsie Holland hasn't had any," I said. "Let me see," said Miss Marple. "Is that the Symington's nursery governess? The one you dreamt about, Mr. Burton?" "Yes." "She's probably had one and wouldn't say so," said Joanna. "No," I said, "I believe her. So does Nash." "Dear me," said Miss Marple. "Now that's very interesting. That's the most interesting thing I've heard yet." As we were going home, Joanna told me that I ought not to have repeated what Nash said about letters coming. "Why not?" "Because Mrs. Dane Calthrop might be it." "You don't really believe that?" "Well, I'm not sure. She's a queer woman." We began our discussion of probables all over again. It was 2 nights later that I was coming back in the car from Exhampton. I had had dinner there and then started back, and it was already dark before I got into Lymstock. Something was wrong with the car lights, and after slowing up and switching on and off, I finally got out to see what I could do. I was some time fiddling, but I managed to fix them up finally. The road was quite deserted. Nobody in Lymstock is about after dark. The first few houses were just ahead, amongst them the ugly gabled building of the Women's Institute. It loomed up in the dim starlight, and something impelled me to go and have a look at it. I don't know whether I had caught a faint glimpse of a stealthy figure flitting through the gate. If so, it must have been indeterminate that I did not register in my conscious mind, but I did suddenly feel an kind of overweening curiosity about the place. The gate was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open and walked in. A short path and 4 steps led up to the door. I stood there a moment, hesitating. What was I really doing there? I didn't know, and then suddenly, just near at hand, I caught the sound of a rustle. It sounded like a woman's dress. I took a sharp turn and went round the corner of the building towards where the sound had come from. I couldn't see anybody. I went on and again turned a corner. I was at the back of the house now, and suddenly I saw, only 2 feet away from me, an open window. I crept up to it and listened. I could hear nothing, but somehow or other I felt convinced that there was somebody inside. My back wasn't too good for acrobatics as yet, but I managed to hoist myself up and drop over the sill inside. I made rather a noise, unfortunately. I stood just inside the window listening. Then I walked forward, my hands outstretched. I heard the faintest sound ahead of me to my right. I had a torch in my pocket and I switched it on. Immediately a low, sharp voice said, "Put that out." I obeyed instantly, for in that brief second I had recognised Superintendent Nash. I felt him take my arm and propel me through a door and into a passage. Here, where there was no window to betray our presence to anyone outside, he switched on a lamp and looked at me more in sorrow than in anger. "You would have to butt in just at that minute, Mr. Burton." "Sorry," I apologised, "but I got a hunch and that I was on to something." "And so you were, probably. Did you see anyone?" I hesitated. "I'm not sure," I said slowly, I've got the vague feeling I saw someone sneak in through the front gate, but I didn't really see anyone. Then I heard a rustle round the side of the house. Nash nodded. That's right. Somebody came around the house before you. They hesitated by the window, then went on quickly. Heard you, I expect. I apologised again. What's the big idea? I asked. Nash said, I'm banking on the fact that an anonymous letter writer can't stop writing letters. She may know it's dangerous, but she'll have to do it. It's like a craving for drink or drugs. I nodded. Now you see, Mr. Burton, I fancy whoever it is will want to keep the letters looking the same as much as possible. She's got the cut-out pages of that book and can go on using letters and words cut out of them. But the envelopes present a difficulty. She'll want to type them up on the same machine. She can't risk using another typewriter or her own handwriting. Do you really think she'll go on with the game? I asked incredulously. Yes, I do. And I'll bet you anything you like she's full of confidence. They're always as vain as hell, these people. Well then, I figured out that whoever it was would come to the Institute after dark so as to get at the typewriter. Miss Ginch? I said. Maybe. You don't know yet. I don't know, but you suspect? Yes, but somebody's very cunning, Mr. Burton. Somebody knows all the tricks of the game. I could imagine some of the network that Nash had spread abroad. I had no doubt that every letter written by a suspect and posted or left by hand was immediately inspected. Sooner or later the criminal would slip up, would grow careless. For the third time I apologised for my zealous and unwanted presence. Oh well, said Nash philosophically, it can't be helped. Better luck next time. I went out into the night. A dim figure was standing beside my car. To my astonishment, I recognised Megan. Hello, she said. I thought this was your car. What have you been doing? What are you doing is much more to the point, I said. I'm out for a walk. I like walking at night. Nobody stops you and says silly things, and I like the stars, and things smell better, and everyday things look more mysterious. All of that I grant you freely, I said, but only cats and witches walk in the dark. They'll wonder about you at home. No, they won't. They never wonder where I am or what I'm doing. How are you getting on? I asked. All right, I suppose. Miss Holland look after you and all that? Elsie's all right. She can't help being a perfect fool. Unkind, but probably true, I said. Hop in and I'll drive you home. It was not quite true that Megan was never missed. Symington was standing on the doorstep as we drove up. He peered towards us. Hello, is Megan there? Yes, I said, I've brought her home. Symington said sharply, You mustn't go off like this without telling us, Megan. Miss Holland has been quite worried about you. Megan muttered something and went past him into the house. Symington sighed. A grown-up girl is a great responsibility with no mother to look after her. She's too old for school, I suppose. He looked towards me rather suspiciously. I suppose you took her for a drive? I thought it best to leave it like that. Well, now we've been introduced to Miss Marple. I wonder if she's putting two and two together and maybe getting some different characters than Jerry and Joanna are. We'll wait till next time. Thanks for joining me.